welcome Dr. Nikki Lisa-Cole to the stage for our recommendations. Nikki is a sociologist and senior researcher at Know Center in the Open and Reproducible Research Group. Her research focuses on questions of equity and ethics in research design and conduct, with a particular focus on societal inclusion in open and responsible research. Nikki contributed to On-MERRIT with research focused on the uptake of research by policymakers and co-led the process of co-creating the recommendations based on the project results. Nikki, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. Let me share. Okay, let me get this into full screen. Thank you for your patience. So again, thank you, Thomas. I'm really happy to share with you today the outcomes and recommendations from the On-MERRIT project. In this presentation, I will draw together some of the findings you've heard presented by my colleagues in order to provide some evidence and context for the recommendations. And I'll also share with you a bit about the process of how we did that co-creation. So to start with, we recognized as we completed the work packages of 3, 4, and 5, about which you've heard from my colleagues, 4 areas of concern stood out to us across our findings in terms of areas we could respond to with recommendations. And all of these things work to foster exclusion of some and undue advantage for others, and undermine the equitable uptake of open and responsible research. The first is the expensive nature of conducting open and responsible research and the many resources required to do so. And by this, I mean things like funding for training or infrastructure, funding for jobs that support open and responsible research, among many other things. We also honed in on the high cost of APCs for OA publishing and the effects of stratification that this system appears to be having. And we have also focused on the unrealized potential for the greater uptake of research results by policymakers and the limited inclusion of diverse publics in research and policymaking, despite the best efforts of many people already practicing open and responsible research. And finally, the fourth area we have chosen to focus on based on our findings is institutional practices of reward and recognition, given that they most often do not support and often undermine or discourage open research values and practices, as you heard from our colleague, Sarah Deraika, earlier. So all of these things are fostering cumulative advantage for well-resourced actors and disadvantage for others in the open and responsible research space. So how to respond to that? We moved forward with a co-creation process in order to come up with recommendations for funders, research institutions, and researchers. And in order to make these recommendations viable for these groups, we thought best to include them in the process. So we recruited a group, a diverse gender balanced group of 29 experts drawn from each of these stakeholder categories and representing 27 organizations from 16 countries. They are primarily drawn from the EU, but they also include participants from Africa and Latin America, and they range from early career to senior researchers. And the process we engaged in with this group was a modified Delphi process, or an iterative process of reaching consensus around a set of recommendations. So our goal was to reach consensus, and we did in the end on 30 recommendations. And we went through several rounds of presenting recommendations after having gathered them internally and externally, discussing and debating them with our co-creation community, and then revising them. So we went through this process several times with our co-creation community. And in the end, we came to, as I said, 30 recommendations that are presented in our briefing doc, Global Thinking, On-Merit Recommendations for Maximizing Equity in Open and Responsible Research. And you can find this on our website under results listed as D6.4 and also permanently on our Zenodo page linked here. Now, as I mentioned, this report is created primarily by and with EU actors in mind, but with awareness of and appreciation for the global inequities that exist within the research community and between regions, and with an eye toward addressing some of these through cross-regional collaborations. We emphasize in the introduction to our briefing the need for joined up approaches that target the research ecosystem as a whole in order to avoid siloed policy approaches. And on the whole, our recommendations are aimed at leveling the resources playing field to make open and responsible research possible for more people, at fostering institutional support for open and responsible research through a variety of means, and fostering greater societal inclusion in and access to research and policymaking. And certainly you will notice through this description alone that there is some overlap with the UNESCO recommendations on open science, some of which Sarah spoke to earlier. We use these symbols to indicate, seen on your screen, to which actors a recommendation applies. So in our briefing, some recommendations apply to all three, funders, institution, and researchers. Some apply to a combination of the two or to just one. But we want to emphasize that within this briefing doc, there are recommendations for everyone involved in the scientific community, and that there are actionable ones that you can implement right now. So we do hope you'll take a look. I'll give you a brief overview now of the 4 areas of concern that we decided to focus on, and I'll give you an example recommendation for each of them. So the problem of resource intensity. As you have seen through my colleague Peter's presentation, practicing open and responsible research requires considerable economic, institutional, social, and cultural resources. Therefore, rewarding open practices can create cumulative advantage for well-resourced actors. And those resources include things like training, infrastructures to support research planning, data hosting and sharing, publication, computer power, skills, etc. And therefore, researchers in less resourced settings are at a disadvantage. And specifically from our results, I want to highlight that there is a disconnect, right, between the awareness of the importance of open research and RRI and the uptake of these practices, and that training for open research practices is low, and there is low integration of open research topics in formal curricula. And also we have found that institutions lack enough qualified research support staff to train on open research. So in response to these issues, we have crafted a set of recommendations that focus on how institutions can best support training for open and responsible research, what kinds of institutional requirements and support would best do that. And we've also crafted recommendations that speak to the need to share knowledge and resources across institutions in order to make the process of supporting open research an open process itself. We have recommendations that advocate for the transparency of costs in terms of the cost of doing open research, but also the cost of not doing open research. And also recommendations that speak to how best to monitor the impacts of open research uptake. So an example from our briefing doc is the following. A recommendation aimed at all 3 stakeholder groups that says that funders, institutions, and researchers should encourage and support the use of sustainable, shared, open research tools, training materials, and infrastructure to foster inclusivity, reduce costs, and promote open standards. And you'll see here and in our briefing doc that with each recommendation, we provide a little bit of context to help the reader understand where we're coming from and what we're speaking to with each recommendation. On the next topic, the problem of APCs and stratification. We recognize, as I'm sure most of you in this audience do as well, that the high cost of APCs are a problem within the scientific research community. It is a model that has taken down a barrier to readership, which is a good thing, but it has simultaneously erected a barrier to publishing for some. And this is a serious issue given what we've heard about the fact that the highest impact journals, considered the most prestigious, have the highest APCs. And also that research shows that early career researchers, those from less resourced regions and disciplines, and those with limited English competence, as well as women, who are more often to consider cost, are at a particular disadvantage. So this signals that there is a serious problem with inequality happening within open access publishing. From our own research, we highlight that well-resourced actors are more likely to publish open access and in journals with high APCs, and that well-resourced institutions are best able, as Peter said, to adapt to, and benefit from OA publishing. So in response to these issues, we have focused on recommendations that speak to the need for cost transparency in terms of what institutions pay to access open access content, as well as what they pay for it to be published. And we have advocated for support for open repositories and author self-archiving as alternatives to these high-cost models, and also to alternative publishing models and open infrastructure to support alternative publishing means. And an example recommendation, again targeted to all three stakeholder groups, is that funders, institutions, and researchers should support alternative publishing models where those show potential to be more inclusive, including consortial funding models for open publishing infrastructures, which support open access publishing with no author-facing charges. The third area of concern for us is the problem of societal inclusion. Open and responsible research promises greater uptake of research by policymakers and more equitable societal inclusion in research and policymaking, yet mechanisms of exclusion are getting in the way of these goals, as my colleague Bernhard spoke to. Research shows that policymakers prefer to receive information through their social networks, which limits the pool of actors with access to policymaking. And there is inadequate institutional support for working at the science policy interface and for broadening societal inclusion in research. From our own results, I want to highlight, as Bernhard explained earlier, that uptake of science by policymakers hinges on relationships and upstream engagement. And this has implications for how research institutions can support researchers to do this work, as well as implications for who gets to participate. And we have found that the pool of researchers who has access to the science policy interface is small. And again, despite best efforts, the world's poorest and most vulnerable remain excluded from open research and policymaking. Therefore, our recommendations focused on this area of concern include those that speak to how to establish and support best practices in socially inclusive research in order to open up research and policymaking to more participants. Recommendations that focus on the importance of funding and support for societal and policy engagement, and to broadening inclusion and diversity, both in terms of who gets to participate in research, but also who is involved in research teams. And we also make recommendations that speak to the critical nature of the open sharing of understandable research outputs. An example recommendation in this topic is that funders, institutions, and researchers should support mutual understanding between all stakeholders regarding good practices and key challenges and opportunities in socially inclusive research. Finally, we come to the problem of reward and recognition, which we heard quite a bit about earlier from Sarah. Structures of reward and recognition often do not support the uptake of open and responsible research practices, and sometimes even discourage them. This could either disincentivize the uptake of these practices or damage the career prospects of those who commit to them. There's an overuse of quantitative metrics and an underuse of qualitative ones, as Sarah explained rather well, and that researchers who value open research practices believe that their peers and institutions do not. Therefore, they are less inclined to practice them. So we highlight from our findings that criteria related to open and responsible research are rare within the policies of research performing institutions, and that researchers value qualitative factors like collaboration, collegiality, mentoring, and quality in the research process more than institutions do, and that this is at odds, as Peter explained, with what institutions value about the research process. And this signals to us that there is a need for a culture change surrounding reward and recognition practices. And therefore, we have made recommendations that would support such a change. The areas of focus include exactly that, changing assessment culture and practices through a variety of means, doing it in a way that allows for the flexible assessment given the diversity of academic disciplines, research approaches and practices, as well as the diversity of work that goes into research. Recommendations that speak to the importance of new assessment practices, or the redefinition of it being collaborative and multi-stakeholder, that everybody has a voice in determining what best assessment practices are, and that these should be shared when they are established. They should be open and available and shared amongst all within the scientific community. And also that sustainable career pathways should be made available not just for research staff, but for those that support open and responsible research in particular. So an example recommendation, speaking to funders and institutions this time, is that they should support a change in assessment culture, moving beyond narrow quantitative indicators to value quality, openness, collaboration, and responsibility in research, and recognize the full range of academic tasks. So I've highlighted here just a few of our recommendations. To learn more and to read all 30 of them, you can visit our website or download the recommendations directly from this link. And you're welcome to contact me or our coordinator and PI, Tony Ross Hallauer, for any questions about those recommendations, and we within the team look forward to receiving your questions in this next question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. And we now indeed have a couple of minutes, a half an hour, to discuss the broader implications and recommendations in detail. I'll share the questions that we have until now momentarily. I hope you can see them now. So we have a couple of questions already. One, a more technical question on the results, and then a couple of questions on APCs. So I'd suggest we first tackle the technical question, that is how the use of Science Hub, I guess they meant Sci-Hub, would affect the results. The question was posted while Peter was presenting.
Perhaps we can ask Peter and Bernhard to turn their cameras back on.
Yes.
To be present for this. Thanks, Thomas. Peter, do you want to tackle that?
Yes, I think we can answer that. So in the study that we considered, we actually did consider Sci-Hub. We didn't sort of use data from Sci-Hub, but we did take Sci-Hub into account, and we think that Sci-Hub doesn't somehow invalidate the results at all, because effectively we did not, our evidence of using a particular research paper when we considered production and consumption of open access was not the number of downloads or anything like that. We actually used as evidence of use the act of someone effectively citing the particular research paper. So from this, effectively the fact that something was what Sci-Hub could lead into would be that certain research papers which normally would not be read, happens to be read effectively, and that would mean that if there is any such effect, and we cannot confirm that, that would mean basically that there would be maybe slightly, we would measure slightly less benefit for some of those institutions. But I think we looked also at data before Sci-Hub, and we looked at data just after Sci-Hub. And it was very interesting to see that we did not observe any material difference in that data, and so perhaps Sci-Hub undoubtedly has effect on a lot of things. It might have effect, I think, largely on the population of the global public that wants to read research literature. But what we were essentially measuring in our study was more the effect on the researchers themselves, who are creators of research literature, and we have not seen a substantial impact there. And it could be, again, a sign of cumulative advantage. It could be the case that actually researchers at institutions tend to have access to research papers. It might be that actually the general public doesn't have that access, and maybe Sci-Hub effectively supports more the general public, the people who are not creators of research, who can now access the content.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to move into one of the discussions that's emerging from the questions that we have, which is on open access publishing and APCs in particular. And I think some of the questions are very similar in some extent. So I'll start with this one here, which asks whether we can achieve open access without changing the current business model of publishers, and whether it is possible to stop publishing in magazines with high costs for OA. I'm not sure, Tony. Thanks.
Nikki, do you want to?
I think you might be best poised to answer this. But I would say that one thing we've heard from our co-creation community with quite a lot of emphasis when we did this process was that we have to take care to not make recommendations that would jeopardize the careers of early career researchers. And telling people not to publish in certain venues is considered to be a risky move, right? But otherwise, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, just putting in place open access at all was threatening to change the business model of publishers. The moving to fund open access via APCs or even through these kind of transitional agreements is all about changing their business models. I think there's two questions here, right? So I think the move to open access, so the business model of scholarly publishing beforehand was, at least on the internet, put it online, put a paywall in front of it and charge for access. And now that business model is obviously being changed. The question of whether it's possible to stop publishing in journals with high costs, I mean, I think the problem is that the high costs are correlated to the high impact, and at least in the minds of most researchers, this is where they want to publish because they know that they will get rewarded for, I mean, not only because they know they'll get rewarded there, they also have like a sense of community, and they have this kind of legacy view that kind of being published in certain places is the goal. This is definitely one of the key problems that the root of the problems that I think Dora and all these initiatives are trying to get at, but it's a very persistent connection, I guess.
Thanks, Tony. Sorry for interrupting. I'm not sure whether anyone else would like to say something, but from the questions here, I think there's also there's a second question that is closely related, where the person asked whether there is a risk kind of to create parallel publishing streams that would be problematic in the long run. So would you recommend to what would you recommend on this?
I mean, to a certain extent, like having green and gold always kind of encouraged like two streams. And I've heard it still, like people saying to me, when we report APCs are stratifying publication patterns, and that it excludes global south, and it's always global north, usually men, who tell me, yeah, but they can just publish green OA anyway. I don't think that like encouraging alternative publishing models and what's called diamond OA is going to lead to a two-stream system. I think the point is to make the system diamond OA. We've shown that there's enough money in the system many times over, and it's just a matter of coordinating the institutions who currently pay that money out in various ways to publishers, coordinating those institutions to use that money in a structured way to enable a system that's free to read and free to publish. Anybody else? Bernhard or Peter? I don't want to hog the floor.
I don't think I have a clear answer to this, but what I see is that the cost of green OA, let's say on a per article basis, is significantly lower than the cost of gold OA. And from that perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense to encourage people to self-archive and to basically, I think, create some sort of a system of recognition for those who actually decide only to self-archive. The fact that a certain research paper is deposited within a repository, which is, for instance, very common in astronomy, or in computer science using, let's say, archive.org, should not be, and that this same paper is, let's say, not published in a highly reputable journal, should not be seen as a limitation to the merits of this particular document. And I think this is really important, and we need to change this culture, because we see that especially, from the analysis that we've carried out, at the in terms of understanding what is in the promotion policies, we see that actually there are very strong incentives in those policies for researchers to make sure that they actually publish in highly reputable journals, and don't basically base their career on self-archiving, and that clearly makes it easier and creates an advantage for those who are based at highly reputable institutions that can afford APCs.
Thanks, Peter. And I think what came out in your statement already is reflected in a question that we have here, whether about the general publishing model, whether the dissemination of knowledge in the form of journal articles is kind of the most useful unit, or whether there could be different alternatives that might fare better in terms of also this mentioned conflation between prestige and market shares.
Yeah, if I can just say here, 3 or 4 years ago, at the start of Plan S, I remember being really disappointed that I just perceived it as being far too heavy on gold OA, and especially gold OA through article processing charges, and especially flipping these. I think the thought was the researchers want to publish in these journals, let's just make these journals OA and allow the publishers the money. I really think that open access was always the moment, and was always the moment. You see this in the founding of OAI PMH, and the kind of the idea of what we could transform the scholarly system into. And I think already in the 90s, everybody knew that once the archive was there, that all you really needed to do was put filtering, review, curation services on top, and you already had kind of a publishing system that was fit for the internet. And it's still I still believe that is the case. There's a huge move at the moment towards publish, review, and then curate initiatives like eLife, but also through the pandemic, all the review services that operated on top of preprints and so on. And I really think that in terms of overturning or getting away from I think that's the jump that we need to be working to, rather than just trying to adapt this current system. Because if we just try to adapt this current system, then the publishers always win. No matter what happens in open access, the publishers always maintain their profits.
Thanks, Tony. I'd like to take one last question for now on the open access topic, and then also dip into other arenas there. And the last question would be about Open Research Europe, whether you and we know anything about how this is being perceived and how this would fit into the picture that we discussed already. Not sure whether Peter or others would want to comment on that.
Shall I go again?
Please.
So I think I wrote a paper on this, actually. Forgive me, but I'll put it in the chat. It's called "Are Funder Open Access Platforms a Good Idea?" And the answer was yes, but it would be great if they were based on open source technologies owned and operated by the communities. And I wrote that because at the time you could see that the F1000 were moving in this direction, and you kind of knew that as soon as F1000 got a really big funder on the hook, that they would be sold to a major publisher, and that's exactly what happened. So there are amazing community-owned publishing infrastructures, open journal systems, or Janeway, operated by Open Library of Humanities, or the system that provides SciPost. And so I think that yes, funders offering these kind of catch-all publication services for all types of research is a great idea. I would just like to see them more based on open infrastructures. But I think also that this is kind of a direction that Open Research Europe itself is trying to go.
Thanks, Tony. As I said, and as is reflected in a question here, there are also other areas of science and scientific life. And the person asked here whether the current developments on recognition and reward including other aspects of academic life, whether they are considered there, and which results, if any, we had on that during our project.
So maybe can I pick this up? We had a look at a number of open science and responsible research and innovation aspects and the role they play in reward and recognition. We couldn't study all of them, but we studied a number of them. And we have seen actually that the perception of researchers towards these sort of new and sort of innovative, and perhaps some of them would be sort of soft measures, you know, of like, do you share research data, and do you make your research reproducible, and these kinds of things. The response of researchers to these aspects is usually very positive. It is perhaps with some of these exceptions that, you know, they sometimes realize that putting them into practice is perhaps not so obvious and not so easy. But when it's confronted with the fact that these that the institution doesn't really value those things, or doesn't, maybe the institution doesn't sort of, maybe the institution values them but takes them for granted and doesn't completely explicitly value them during the promotion processes. And this, I think, creates the wrong incentives for researchers. You know, it's the researchers don't focus on those aspects. They don't focus on these. They are not incentivized to do this. And I feel that we will only see a change once the policies, the promotion policies, really do explicitly adapt these open science and RRI practices. And I think this will be a very strong drive towards open access and open science. And so we really need better policies which mention a wider, perhaps a variety of these practices.
Can I just maybe follow that up? I think with other aspects of academic life, I think there are a few other aspects that we did look at. Peter showed this slide from the survey where we asked, like, what's important to your institution and what's important to you, and then look at the mismatch. And there was a big mismatch, not only on open science stuff and stuff directly related to research, but also on aspects like collegiality and mentorship and and leadership, more abstract concepts of the idea of being an academic. And there was like our participants definitely valued these more, but we didn't look at teaching, and we only looked at kind of service aspects as they were related to kind of service to research. So it wasn't kind of, we were very focused on the research assessment, I guess, and this is definitely an area where we could move to broader scope for future research.
Thanks, Tony. Nikki, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in response to that, that is something that came up in the discussions while we were co-creating our recommendations. And so at least one of our recommendations does speak to the need to recognize these other aspects of academic life. And part of that, which we also heard about in our research into the uptake of science by policymakers, is that oftentimes those who do participatory research with a broad range of actors are sort of framed as doing sort of like care work within their departments or institutions, because it's seen as sort of like more community focused work. And so that's an issue as well that needs to be looked out for, that the type of research can also be sort of shunted aside if it's not considered, quote, proper scientific research. And that's something that we also look out for in our recommendations.
Thanks, Nikki. There's a couple of more questions, and I'd like to move the conversation more to kind of questions of the future, how the recommendations could get put into practice. And the question here that we have is that given that public research funding is often justified to address national interests, what self-interest arguments could persuade each stakeholder towards actually making this happen, more globally equitable openness?
I'll jump in on that.
Please.
Something that I think seemed to come to the fore in our work when we particularly looked at the SDG cases of climate science, agriculture, and also health, is that none of these issues are bound by national borders, and policymakers understand that. And obviously research scientists understand that as well. We worked with some researchers who focus on climate science who are doing projects focused on the cascading impacts of climate change, on how these, how drought in one region can affect food production, and that cascades. It can have impacts on all kinds of other aspects of our life and what we consume. So I think that there is already an awareness of that from policy and research side. And perhaps it's a question of just looking to amplify that perspective where we can. But also there's an element of, sharing of resources is a two-way street. I think perhaps implicit in the question is that this is an area for well-resourced actors to share with those that are less well-resourced. But what happens when you collaborate in an open way is that those that are already well-resourced are also gaining knowledge and insights, access to data, access to potentially research practices, methods, design that they wouldn't necessarily have access to without those collaborations. And so I think that's another way in which that kind of work can be supported, is to point out the scientific gain or the research gain, the network gain that can come from sharing across borders.
Thanks, Nikki. Anyone else on a particular question?
Well, just to back up what Nikki said there, and I think when we look at, like in the EC statements about open science, for instance, very often they talk about economic growth, and often explicitly about European economic growth. And so here there really is a key tension in kind of open science for whom. I think that looking beyond these kind of narrow national or kind of territorial or regional borders is definitely necessary once you get into the kind of research like targeted at the grand societal challenges. Climate change doesn't have borders, and it needs global action. And this is why we chose these like health, agriculture, and climate as kind of our 3 SDGs, where we'd look in depth at the actual research, and especially because these are global challenges that require global solutions. If certain voices are dominating those conversations, then this is not good. And so this is why, for instance, in Thomas's work on APC stratification, we look specifically at kind of who is publishing OA and SDG research. It's a plug for you, Thomas.
Thanks, Tony. And yeah, to build on that, kind of moving into the direction of where the recommendations that we have drafted kind of could make the strongest difference, let's say. There's a question here on the structural forces that drive stratification, and that are kind of the question, the person asking the question says stable over time, and yeah, whether and where open research could actually have an impact there to increase inclusivity.
Yeah, I saw that one. I was trying to avoid it. And does anyone else want it? No. Well, the first thing I'd say is yes, structural forces of stratification are persistent and everywhere. But the point is that open science, when like it was really, I talk as kind of a, I really wasn't an idea. I think I'm still an idealist, but like I really drank the Kool-Aid about open science when we first started. And then I started to notice how it was meant to be all things to all people, and it's going to bring greater efficiency and participation and transparency. And the funders want better return on investment, and we want this and we want this. You need to prioritize things that you want. And I really think that open science should have equity as one of the core principles. And if that's the case, then we should study the ways in which open science can best be implemented to maximize equity. I think especially if we have broader systems of publication, which are free to read and free to publish. In certain parts of the world, they have had that for a long time. And those systems are actually being, so in Latin America, for example, there is a long history of gold away with no APCs. And I know that there are some of those journals now think that they would need to start charging APCs just because that is now the de rigueur model. I think if we can share our resources and make sure that that just basic problems of digital divide and competences don't exclude certain people, then we can have kind of the open science future that we would want to see that would maximize equity. I think that's the main point of our recommendations.
I did want to respond to that question, but I was getting distracted by comments in the chat. I have something more. Tony just gave a very good sort of global level response to that. I have something perhaps more specific to point to from our work in task 5, which is that I was very inspired and encouraged when I heard from the researchers that we worked with about the impact of their research design and methods in including marginalized or vulnerable populations, using those terms very flexibly to, be defined as they are within whatever context the research might be occurring within. But what I mean is that taking participatory or multi-stakeholder approaches to research design, which are by their definition more open than traditional academic research, so many more viewpoints can be brought into the process of creating scientific knowledge that would otherwise be excluded, that are traditionally excluded. And that this really changes the nature of the scientific output in a way that makes it democratic and inclusive. And this is feeding into the representation that goes into policymaking when these researchers are working at the science policy interface. So I don't think that's the be all and end all. Like, of course, we determined through our recommendations that funding for that work is critical. If funding isn't there, if institutional support and recognition for that kind of work isn't there, it's not going to happen on a larger scale. But it seems to me from what we've found that that's really important.